welcome back. Today we're making use of some of my dream fabric to make a two-piece dress. The plan for the dress is to make a bodice piece with billowing sleeves with some chiffon, and then for the skirt I wanted to make it a two-piece outfit that would just allow me to make two separate interchangeable skirts, one long and one short. This would just give me the chance to switch out the skirt for whichever I felt fit the occasion. For my fabrics, I found this really pretty sequined floral fabric, and then for my underskirt I used this really nice baby blue silk. First order of business, ironing out all the problem lines. Look at all those messy creases. Following that, I went ahead and traced the pattern for both my skirts. I went with the classic circle skirt, 20 inches in length for my shorter skirt and 38 inches in length for my longer one. And I just pinned it along the sides just to keep the fabric in place. For the pattern itself, I went with the 4-panel skirt just to make it easier when it came to measuring and tracing for my pattern. Here I just repeated the same circle skirt pattern for both my satin and the sequin fabrics. And just a heads up, if you plan to trace your patterns onto some scrap fabric, I don't have muslin, but you can if you do. So I just used some old bed sheets. They were clean, I promise. And I just made this scrap pattern just to allow me to repeat the pattern onto any fabric that I have. It makes all the difference. In assembling the skirt, I just sewed along the long edge of each of the panels just to create a hem so it can contain the insane flyaway threads that was occurring. Then I just sewed together all the panels, lining up each of their sides, and I did this for both my satin and sequin fabrics. This just left the last panel open so I can have easy access for draping later on. After sewing together all the panels, I went around and just sewed a hem along the entire bottom edge of the skirt pieces. And then I just repeated this for the sequin fabric layer. And here is the skirt with the finished hem and the inner seams. Here, I just laid the satin skirt under my sequin skirt and lined them up to then pin around it and sew the two layers together. This just allowed me to keep the skirt layered together and lined up properly. Next comes the waistband. For this, I cut out a pattern for my own waist measurements and doubled the width so it can fold over, and then using this, I cut out the silk and sequin fabrics. I did it twice, once for each of my skirts. To get some structure in the waistband, I used the same pattern and cut out a section of mid-weight interfacing, and the interfacing just irons on to the back of the satin piece. Next, I just layered my satin with the interface and the sequin fabric onto one another, and then just sewed it onto my waistband. A quick tip, if you weren't aware, to line up your waistband to your skirt, is to just find the middle point of both your waistband and your skirt, mark it, and line those up. It just gives you a ensured middle to make sure you have a defined center point to work with. I also made sure to sew up the short sides of the bands. Once sewing on the waistband, the band is folded, so the back side is sewn on. Following the line I just sewed, I try to get as close as possible to that line, just so it looks hidden in a sense. You will not believe how slow I was going. This video is currently at 4 times speed. Here you can see how close I had to get to that line, but here is the finished waistband. And with that, the last thing needed for the skirt is to add the zipper up and close the last 2 panels. I decided to go with an invisible zipper just to make it look cleaner on the outside. And once the zipper is attached, we just need to sew together the last bottom portion under the zipper, and the skirt is done. Here's the final zipper and skirt. to the bodice now. I went ahead and draped a pattern for an 8-piece bodice. I decided to split the bodice down the center just for symmetry's sake, but it'd probably be easier in the long run just to make a larger front panel in hindsight. Regardless of my horrible past decisions, as always, just make sure to leave about an inch border when you're cutting your pattern out. And similar to the skirt, the bodice pieces were all cut out from both the blue satin and the sequin fabric for my pattern. The satin layer itself needed to be cut twice for each piece, so I had a panel as backing and as well as a panel to act as my inner lining. I also wanted to add some structure to the bodice, so I added midway interfacing to each of the silk panels that I had pinned with the sequin fabric, and it was my first time working with interface, so it was quite a learning curve to fully understand how to apply it without problems. But I went around and I measured out the border about 1/2 centimeter just to trim the edges for a cleaner shape, and ensured my measurements were kept consistent for all the panels. In sewing together all the panels, I pinned along all the edges and sewed along each of the long sides, doing pretty side to pretty side. And this same step was then repeated for the satin inner lining, and as well as the sequin pieces. At this point, we now have the 2 main pieces set up, and all is left is to assemble. I just sewed along the top edge of the bodice piece following the neckline I made, and once sewn the top 2 curves of the bodice, I made sure to make little cuts just to compensate for the curve so it won't be too bulky. When we turn the bodice back the correct way, you can see that the corner isn't as bulky. In order to ensure that the bodice stayed up, I also added boning at each of the seams of the bodice. And when I did the lengths, I made sure to make it just slightly shorter than the actual seam so it won't be stabbing me out of the fabric. Realistically though, you only need enough length to allow for that added structure, so any longer you might just end up just stabbing yourself through the fabric. And you can see here that when I actually ended up cutting it, I did it a bit longer than it was necessary and just trimmed it a bit shorter before I sewed it in. With the remaining details of the bodice done, we just need to close up the bottom of the bodice. Once done, the next order of business is to complete the billowing sleeves. For the sleeves, we just have this large curve to the left where I'm just going to connect the sleeve to the bodice, and the right edge is for where the wrist is going to cinch. And to just assemble this, we're going to fold the piece in half, lengthwise, and then sew along the inner curve for both the pieces. Then to attach the sleeve to the bodice, I just pinned it along where the bodice is on my dress form and then made sure to center the seam to the side seam of the bodice. And then I decided how far I wanted the sleeve to connect just to make sure it would look right when I wear it. With that, I sewed a hem to the top shoulder edge to hide the loose threads, and then attached the elastics to get the cinch look for both the shoulder and the wrist. For the shoulder, I used an elastic that was about 13.5 inches long, and for the wrist, I used some elastic that was about 7.25 inches long. You can note that the wrist elastics are completely different from the other elastic. I ended up running out of that other elastic, so you know how we all have that random stash of stuff we keep telling ourselves we'll throw out or recycle, but we never actually do it? Well, look at this. I finally used it. I kept these elastic bands from some Christmas gift, hence the gold color, but it's some good elastic, so why not use it? To attach the elastic, I first sewed in some basting stitches, and then I pulled the two ends of the threads to create that crinkled look. And then I made sure to spread out the crinkles evenly to make it however I like it. And then I sewed the elastic in between this. This just made sure that the total length matched up with the elastic, so when I put on the bodice, the sleeve doesn't just slip off. Once the elastic was sewn on fully, I just pulled the two strings out from the basting stitch, and this was just repeated for both the wrist and the top elastics. In my case, I should note that because the elastic for the wrist was pretty thin and cylindrical, I ended up using a zigzag stitch just to secure that elastic on, and I hand stitched the first stitch to make sure that it was going to stay. And with that, we're left with these beautiful ruffled sleeves. Finally, we just need to close up the back side of the bodice. And for this, I just wanted to add some flair, so I decided to go with a nice lace-up design, which also just allowed me an easier time to put on the bodice later on. To make the lace-up pieces, we just need a really long piece of fabric for the lace-up rope itself, which I measured to be about 1.5 inches wide and 68 inches long. And the smaller strips are going to be the loops in which the lace rope goes through. And from the length of my bodice, I figured that I wanted 4 loops on either side. In this vid, I did 5 just in case I messed up one. And each of the little strips are about 1.5 inches wide and 3 inches long. The other 2 longer strips serve as the fabric that's going to cover the stitches once the loops are attached to the bodice, so we get a cleaner look. And each of them are about 3 inches wide and the length of the bodice plus 2 inches, just to give us some excess. With each of these pieces cut out, next we're just going to fold each of them in half, long ways, and then sew it up with about a 1/2 inch seam. And with all the pieces sewn, we're going to need to just trim off the excess fabric and then turn them all inside out. To do this, I usually take a safety pin and then stick the point through one end and then close the pin and just pull the entire pin through the loop. For the longer loop, it was trickier to do this because it was so long. So instead of using a pin, I used an old dull tipped knitting stick and then pushed it through similar to using the pins. And then once it was all flipped, I ironed everything flat, and then I went ahead and made sure to position everything and then sewed it on. Once done, the last piece to go on is the fabric that's going to cover the stitches, and then securing the loops even further. To get that smooth look and feel, I folded the fabric over the back edge and then sewed it down, making sure to fold in all the edges to secure the loose threads. And with that, you can see that sewing down the edge of the fabric over the loops, I tended to make sure that I'm sewing as close to the edge as I can get, so that way the seam doesn't end up showing too much on the opposite side. And the same deal for the opposite side. And with that, voila! The final dress. This project was definitely one of the bigger ones I have ever worked on, but I'm quite proud of how it turned out. I have learned from this though, sequin fabrics, very difficult to work with. So be warned. With that though, it was a great project to work on, and I'm glad to have been able to